Happy Independence Day. Have you ever heard the story of the Pine Tree Riot? Michael Kinzer with Amanda Howard Sotheby's and Atlanta Fine Homes Sotheby's International Realty. If I may, I'd like to share with you today the story of the Pine Tree Riot. Before I do, let me preface by saying that when you spend as much time in houses as I do, the materials and craftsmen that must come together in perfect harmony to create a beautiful home really take on a special significance. And perhaps no other material or ability to work with such is more important to construction, especially residential construction, as is wood. A couple of years ago, I came across a book by Roland Innes called The Age of Wood. Now, being involved in building and selling homes as I am, this was a book that piqued my interest. And it was so good, I picked it up a week ago to read it again. And with it being the time of year when we celebrate the birth of our nation and the freedoms that so many have fought and died to secure, the story of the Pine Tree Riot hit home. So here's what happened. In the 1700s, the world's two major superpowers, France and Britain, are in an arms race to maintain the strongest navy, and the strongest navy is usually the one who has the most and the biggest ships. Now, getting enough wood to build the ships themselves was no big deal. But when it came to the mainmast, they needed to find trees tall enough and straight enough to do the job. This meant a tree that was 100 to 120 feet tall and didn't have bends in it like the 2x4s we find at Home Depot. It had to be straight. France had plenty of these in an area of the Pyrenees called the Vallée d'Aspe via a newly cut pass called the Chemin de Mature, or Mast Road. Now, this road completed in 1772, this largely solved France's supply shortage. Now, Britain at the time had wooded coverage of less than 10%, and very few of these forests contained trees tall and straight enough to warrant use on a battleship. Decades before, England had turned to the American colonies for their mast supply, but as the arms race continued to escalate, sourcing the large logs became more difficult. The British faced challenges in buying the logs on the open market because loggers and sawmills preferred to saw these trees down into smaller sections, given the enormous hardship of transporting a single heavy 100-foot long tree trunk. The British could have attempted to buy up private forest land, but instead, in 1691, they instituted what's known as the King's Broad Arrow policy, whereby any white pine tree marked with 3 hatchet marks in the upward shape of an arrow were considered crown property and not to be felled by colonists. Now, colonists dispatched with the practical enforceability of this policy simply by cutting these trees into floorboards 23 inches or less to get rid of any evidence. In fact, many homes at the time began to feature exceptionally wide floorboards made from these large trees in a show of contempt for British rule. The British responded by decreeing that no white pine tree less than 12 inches in diameter could be harvested, period, except they left a loophole through which the rule did not apply to trees growing in any established township. Therefore, the peoples of New Hampshire and Massachusetts promptly redrew the lines of all townships to effectively cover the entirety of each colony. Many rural tree fellers just simply ignored the policy altogether. So the conflict comes to a head in 1772. About the same time, the French opened the Chemin de Mature. A fine was levied against the sawmillers of Ware, New Hampshire, for sawing up large white pines, and the millers refused to pay the fine. When the English sheriff was dispatched to collect the fine, over 20 men, led by a great American named Ebenezer Mudgett, assaulted the sheriff and his deputy at their lodging, whipped and beat the 2 men with pine tree switches, and forced them to ride out of town through a gauntlet of jeering townspeople. 8 of the uprisers later agreed to be fined 20 shillings each, which was considered a light punishment and, more importantly, a sign of imperial weakness. Word of the Pine Tree Riot spread and became an inspiration for the Boston Tea Party the following year. George Washington's secretary designed a flag known as the Pine Tree Flag, which became a symbol for resistance and flew above colonist warships when the War for Independence broke out a few years later. And the colonists started selling their tall, straight, white pine trees, not to the British, of course, but to the French Navy. The British were forced to use an inferior option, piecing together smaller trees using iron hoops to connect them in what is known as a made mast. Thus, many of the British ships ended up spending most of the war in port with broken masts. In part, due to French naval superiority, Britain was defeated and America won its independence in 1783. I hope you are enjoying this wonderful holiday with friends and family, and I hope you are enjoying it in a home that you love. And if your home has beautiful wide plank floorboards, even better. Happy Independence Day from all of us at Sotheby's.